Chapter 7 of Savarine's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savarine's Disappearance. Chapter 7. A widow, husbandless, subject to fears. The position of the missing man's wife was a particularly trying and painful one, a position imperatively calling for the sympathy of the community in which she lived. That sympathy was freely accorded to her, but time alone could bring anything like tranquillity to a mind harassed by such manifold anxieties as hers. After a lapse of a few weeks, Squire Harrington generously offered to take the farm off her hands, but to this proposal she was for some time loath to assent. In spite of her fears and misgivings, fitful gleams of hope that her husband would return to her flitted across her mind. If he came back, he should find her at her post. Meanwhile, the neighbours showed her much kindness. They voluntarily formed an organization of labour and harvested her crops, threshed them out, and conveyed them to market for her. Her brother, a young man of 18, came out from town and took up his abode with her, so that she would not be left wholly desolate among strangers. And so the summer and autumn glided by. But this state of things could not last. The strange solitude of her destiny preyed sorely upon her, and when the first snows of winter arrived, bringing with them no tidings of the absent one, the fortitude of the bereaved woman broke down. She gave up the farm, and with her little baby boy and such of her household belongings as she chose to retain, went back to the home of her parents in Millbrook. She was a few $100s better off in this world's goods than she had been when she had left that home about 13 months before, but her spirit was sadly bent, if not altogether broken, and the brightness seemed to have utterly faded out of her life. In process of time she became in some degree accustomed, if not reconciled, to her lot. But her situation was, to say the least, anomalous. Her parents were, on the whole, kind and considerate, but she was conscious of being, after a fashion, isolated from them and from all the rest of the world. She felt as one who was, in the language of the proverb, neither maid, wife, nor widow. She knew not whether her child's father was living or dead. She was barely 23 years of age, but she was not free to form a second marriage, even if she had had any inclination for such a union, which, to do her justice, she had not, for she cherished the memory of her absent lord with fond affection, and persisted in believing that, even if he were living, it was through no fault of his own that he remained away from her. She lived a very quiet and secluded life. In spite of her mother's importunities, she seldom stirred out of doors on weekdays, and saw few visitors. She was a regular attendant at church on Sundays, and sought to find relief from mental depression in the consolations of religion. Her chief consolation, however, lay in her child, upon whom she lavished all the tenderness of a soft and gentle nature. She fondly sought to trace in the little fellow's bright features some resemblance to the lineaments of him she had loved and lost. To do this successfully required a rather strong effort of the imagination, for, to tell the truth, the boy favoured his mother's side of the house, and was no more like his father than he was like the 12 patriarchs. But the fond mother often lives in an ideal world of her own creation, and can trace resemblances invisible to ordinary mortals. So it was with this mother, who often declared that her boy had a way of "looking out of his eyes," as she expressed it, which forcibly brought back the memory of happy days which had forever passed away. Of course Savarine's relatives in the old country received due notice of his strange disappearance, and of the various circumstances connected with that event. Mrs. Savarine had herself communicated the facts, and had also sent over a copy of the Millbrook Sentinel, containing a long and minute account of the affair. A letter arrived from Hertfordshire in due course, acknowledging the receipt of these missives, and inquiring whether the lost had been found. Several communications passed to and fro during the first few months, after which, as there was really nothing further to write about, the correspondence fell off, it being of course understood that should any new facts turn up, they should be promptly made known. The stars do not pause in their spheres to take note of the afflictions of us mortals here below. To the bereaved woman it seemed unaccountable that the succeeding months should come and go as formerly, and as though nothing had occurred to take the saltness and savour out of her young life. Ever and anon her slumbers were disturbed by weird dreams, in which the lost one was presented before her in all sorts of frightful situations. In these dreams, which came to her in the silent watches of the night, she never seemed to look upon her husband as dead. He always seemed to be living, but surrounded by inextricable complications involving great trouble and danger. She sometimes awoke from these night visions with a loud cry which startled the household, and proved how greatly her nerves had been shaken by the untoward circumstances of her fate. In the early spring of the ensuing year she sustained another painful bereavement through the death of her mother. This event imparted an additional element of sadness to her already cloudy existence, but it was not without certain attendant compensations, as it rendered necessary a more active course of life on her part, and so left her less time to brood over her earlier sorrow. No Benvolio was needed to tell us that one fire burns out another's burning, one pain is lessened by another's anguish. Most of us have at one time or another been forced to learn that hard truth for ourselves. This forlorn woman had probably never read the passage, but her experience brought abundant confirmation of it home to her at this time. She was driven to assume the internal management of the household, and found grateful solace in the occupations which the position involved. She once more began to take an interest in the prosaic affairs of everyday life, and became less addicted to looking forward to a solitary, joyless old age, so that, all things considered, this second bereavement was not to be regarded in the light of an affliction absolutely without mitigation. It might well have been supposed that the place she was now called upon to fill would have been the means of drawing closer the ties between her surviving parent and herself. For a time it certainly had that effect. Her presence in his house must have done much to soften the blow to her father, and her practical usefulness was made manifest every hour of the day. She carefully ministered to his domestic needs, and did what she could to alleviate the burden which had been laid upon him. But the old story was once more repeated. In a little more than a year from the time her mother had been laid in her grave, she was made aware of the fact that the household was to receive a new mistress. In other words, she was to be introduced to a stepmother. The event followed hard upon the announcement. As a necessary consequence, she was compelled to assume a secondary place in her father's house. It may be true that first marriages are sometimes made in heaven. It is even possible that second marriages may now and then be forged in the same workshop. But it was soon brought home to Mrs. Savareen that this particular marriage was not among the number. Her stepmother, who was not much older than herself, proved a veritable thorn in her side. She was made to perceive that she and her little boy were regarded in the light of encumbrances, to be tolerated until they could be got rid of, but not passively tolerated. The stepmother was a rather coarse-grained piece of clay, an unsympathetic, unfeeling woman, who knew how to say and to do unpleasant things without any apparent temper or ill will. The immortal clockmaker, when he was in a more quaintly sententious humour than common, once propounded the doctrine that the direct road to a mother's heart is through her child. He might have added the equally incontestable proposition that the most effectual method of torturing a mother's heart is through the same medium. The mother who has an only child, who is all the world to her, is actually susceptible to anything in the shape of interference with her maternal prerogatives. Such interference, by whomsoever exercised, is wholly intolerable to her. This susceptibility may perhaps be a feminine weakness, but it is a veritable maternal instinct, and one with which few who have observed it will have the heart to find fault. In Mrs. Savareen's bosom this foible existed in a high state of development, and her stepmother so played upon it as to make life under the same roof with her a cross too hard to be borne. After a few months' trial, the younger of the two women resolved that a new house must be found for herself and her little boy. The carrying out of this resolve rendered some consideration necessary, for her own unaided means were inadequate for her support. Her father, though not what could be called a poor man, was far from rich, and he had neither the means nor the will to maintain two establishments, however humble. But she was expert with her needle, and did not despair of being able to provide for the slender wants of herself and child. She rented and furnished a small house in the town, while she found that there was no ground for present anxiety as to her livelihood. There was plenty of needlework to be had to keep her nimble fingers busy from morn till night, and her income from the first was in excess of her expenditure. She was constrained to lead a humdrum sort of existence, but it was brightened by the presence and companionship of her boy, who was a constant source of pride and delight to her. Whenever she caught herself indulging in a despondent mood, she took herself severely to task for repining at a lot which might have lacked this element of brightness, and which lacking that, would, it seemed to her, have been too dreary for human endurance. No useful purpose would be served by lingering over this portion of the narrative. Suffice it to say that the current of the lonely woman's life flowed smoothly on several years, during which she received no tidings of her lost husband, and heard nothing to throw the faintest scintilla of light upon his mysterious disappearance. Little Reginald grew apace, and continued to be the one consolation in her great bereavement, the solitary joy which reconciled her to her environment. Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Saverine's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Red Abras. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Saverine's Disappearance. Chapter 8. A guest arrives at the Royal Oak. It was getting on towards the middle of the month of August, 1859. The harvest all along the Millbrook and Spotswood road was in full progress, and a bounteous harvest it was, even for that favoured region. Squire Harrington confidently counted upon a yield of 50 bushels of wheat to the acre. True, he was a model farmer, and knew how to make the most of a good season, but his neighbours were not far behind him, and were looking forward to full granaries when threshing should be over. For once there was little or no grumbling at the dispensations of Providence. The weather had been as propitious as though the local tillers of the soil had themselves had a voice in the making of it, and even gruff Mark Stolliver was constrained to admit that there were fewer grounds for remonstrating with the great disposer of events than usual at this season of the year. Every wheat field in the township presented an active spectacle throughout the day. The cradles were busily piled from early morn till nightfall, and the swaths of golden grain furnished heavy work for the rakers and binders. The commercial crisis of 1857 had made itself felt in the district, as well as in all other parts of Upper Canada. Many of the farmers had fallen considerably behindhand, and had, for once in a way, felt the grip of hard times. But the prolific crops which were now being gathered in bade fair to extricate them from such obligations as they had been compelled to incur, and the prevailing tone was one of subdued though heartfelt satisfaction. On the evening of Saturday, the 13th of the month, sundry of the yeomen who lived thereabouts assembled at Lapierre's after a hard week's work, to congratulate one another on the prospects of the harvest, and to discuss a few tankards of the remaining ale for which the Royal Oak was famous throughout the township. The landlord himself was on hand, as usual, to dispense the hospitalities of his bar and larder. The 5 years which had rolled over his head since that memorable night of Saverine's disappearance had left but slight traces of their passage upon his jovial countenance. He had never been able to fathom the impenetrable secret of that strange July night, but he had all along been wont to remark that the mystery would be cleared up some day, and that he confidently expected to hear some tidings of the missing man before he died. As for his guests, though most of them had resided in the neighbourhood at the time of his disappearance, they had long ceased to give themselves any particular concern about the matter. So long as there had seemed to be any prospect of getting at the bottom of the affair, they had taken a vigorous part in the search, and had exerted themselves to bring the mystery to light. But when month succeeded month without supplying any clue to the puzzle, they had gradually resigned themselves to the situation, and, except when the topic came up for discussion at their Saturday night meetings, they seldom indulged in anything more than a passing allusion to it. 10 o'clock had struck, and it seemed improbable that any further company would arrive. The assembled guests, to the number of 7 or 8, sat in their accustomed places around a goodly sized table in the room behind the bar. Lapierre occupied an easy chair, placed near the door communicating with the bar, so as to be handy in case of his being needed there. Farmer Donaldson had just regaled the circle with his favourite ditty, the roast beef of Old England, which he flattered himself he could render with fine effect. Having concluded his performance, he sat modestly back in his elbow chair, and bowed to the vociferous plaudits accorded to him. The tankards were then charged afresh, and each man devoted himself to the allaying of his thirst for the next minute or two. Mine host had promised to give faintly as tolls the evening chime in the course of the evening, and was now called upon to redeem his pledge. "Ah," he remarked, "that was always a favourite song of mine. And don't you remember how fond of it our friend Saffron used to be? He used to call for it regular every Saturday night, just before supper in the old times. Ah, but that was a strange business. I have never been able to think of it without perspiring." And so saying, he dived into the pocket of his white linen jacket, and produced therefrom a red silk handkerchief, with which he mopped his beaming countenance until it shone again. "Eh," responded Farmer Donaldson, "that was the strangest thing as ever happened in these parts. I wonder if it will ever be cleared up." "You know my opinion about that," resumed the host. "I always said he would turn up, and it is, let me see, yes, it is more than 5 years ago. It was on the night of the 17th of July, 1854, and here it is the middle of August, 1859. Well, well, how the years go by! Saffron was a good sort. I thought much of him, and would like to see him once again." "I don't say but what he was a good fellow," remarked one of the company, "but I can tell you he had a devil of a temper of his own when his blood was up. I remember one night in this very room when he had some words with Sam Dawson about the black mare of his'n. He fired up like a tiger, and that scar on his cheek glowed like a carbuncle. It seemed as if it was going to crack open. I made sure he was going to drop into Sam, and he would have done too, if our landlord hadn't interfered and calmed him down." "Yes, yes," interrupted Farmer Donaldson. "Savareen had his tempers, no doubt, when he had been drinking more free than common. But he was a jolly feller all the same. I wish he was with us at this moment." This sentiment was pretty generally re-echoed all round the festive board. Just then a rather heavy footstep was heard to enter the adjoining bar room from outside. The landlord rose and passed out through the doorway to see if his services were required. The door of the communication was left open behind him, so that the company in the inner room had no difficulty in seeing and hearing everything that took place. In the middle of the bar room stood a short, heavy-set man, whose dress and bearing pronounced him to be a stranger in those parts. He was apparently middle-aged, say somewhere between 35 and 40. His clothing was of expensive material, but cut after a style more pronounced than was seen in Canada, or has ever since been much in vogue here. His hat was a broad-brimmed Panama, which cost $20 if it cost a penny. His coat, so far as could be seen under his thin summer duster, was of fine bluish cloth, short of waist, long of skirt, and, the duster notwithstanding, plentifully besprinkled and travel-stained with dust. The waistcoat, which seemed to be of the same material as the coat, was very open-breasted, and displayed a considerable array of shirt front. Across the left side was hung a heavy gold watch chain, from which depended 2 great bulbous-looking seals. On his feet he wore a pair of gaiters of patent leather, white from the dust of the road. In one hand he carried a light, jaunty malacca cane, while the other grasped a Russian leather portmanteau, called by him and by persons of his kind a valise. He wore no gloves, a fact which enabled you to see on the middle finger of his left hand a huge cluster diamond ring, worth any price from $1,000 upwards. His face was closely shaven, except for a prominent moustache. He had a crisp, curling black hair, worn tolerably short. His eyes were rather dull and vacant, not because he was either slow or stupid, but because he felt or affected to feel a sublime indifference to all things sublunary. You would have taken him for a man who had run the gauntlet of all human experiences, a man to whom nothing presented itself in the light of a novelty, and who disdained to appear much interested in anything you might say or do. Taken altogether, he had that foreign or rather cosmopolitan look characteristic of the citizen of the United States who has led an unsettled, wandering life. His aspect was fully borne out by his accent when he began to speak. "Air you the landlord?" he asked, as the host stepped forward to greet him. He received a reply in the affirmative. "This, then, is the Royal Oak Tavern, and your name is Lapierre." Two nods signified the host's further assent to these undeniable propositions. "Have you got a spare bedroom, and can you put me from now till Monday morning?" The landlord again signified his assent, whereupon the stranger put down his cane and portmanteau on a bench and proceeded to divest himself of his wrapper. "You have had supper?" asked Lapierre. "Well, I had a light tea down to Millbrook, but I know your Saturday night customs at the Royal Oak, and if you ha'n't got any objections, I'd like to take a hand in your 11 o'clock supper. To tell the truth, I'm sharp set, and I know you always have a bite of something appetizing about that time." Upon being informed that supper would be ready at the usual hour, and that he would be welcome to a seat at the board, he signified a desire to be shown to his room, so that he could wash and make himself presentable. In response to an enquiry about his horse, he intimated that the animal for the present consisted of Shank's mare, that he had ridden up from town with Squire Harrington, and dismounted at that gentleman's gate. "The squire offered me to drive me on as far as here," he added, "but as it was only a short walk, I reckoned I would come on afoot." Without further parley, the guest was shown to his chamber, whence he emerged a few minutes later, and presented himself before the company assembled in the room behind the bar. "Hope I ain't intruding, gentlemen," he remarked, as he took a vacant seat at the lower end of the table. "I have often heard of the good times you have here on Saturday nights." "Heard of them?" "When I was a good many 100 miles from here, and when I didn't expect ever to have the pleasure of joining your mess. Yes, I'd better introduce myself. My name's Thomas Jefferson Haskins. I live at Nashville, Tennessee, where I keep a hotel, and do a little in horseflesh now and again. Now I shall take it as a favor if you will allow the landlord to refill your glasses at my expense, and then drink good luck to my expedition." All this with much volubility and without a trace of bashfulness. The company all round the table signified their hearty acquiescence, and while the landlord was replenishing the tankards, the stranger proceeded to further enlighten them respecting his personal affairs. He informed them that a man had cleared out from Nashville about 6 months ago, leaving him, the speaker, in the lurch to the tune of $2,700. A few days since he had learned that the fugitive had taken up his quarters at Spotswood, in Upper Canada, and he had accordingly set out for that place with intent to obtain a settlement. He had reached Millbrook by the 7 o'clock express this evening, only to find that he was still 15 miles from his destination. Upon inquiry, he learned that the stage from Millbrook for Spotswood ran only once a day, leaving Millbrook at 7 o'clock in the morning. There would not be another stage until Monday morning. He was on the point of hiring a special conveyance, and of driving through that night, when all of a sudden he had remembered that Lapierre's tavern was on the Millbrook and Spotswood road, and only 3 miles away. He had long ago heard such accounts of the Royal Oak and its landlord, and particularly of the Saturday night suppers, that he had resolved to repair thither and remain over for Monday's stage. "I was going to hire a livery to bring me out here," he added, "but a gentleman named Squire Harrington, who heard me give the order for the buggy, told me he lived close by the Royal Oak, and that I was welcome to ride out with him, as he was just going to start for home. That saved me a couple of dollars, and so here I be." Lapierre could not feel otherwise than highly flattered by the way the stranger referred to his establishment, but he was wholly at a loss to understand how the fame of the Royal Oak, and more especially of the Saturday night suppers, had extended to so great a distance as Nashville. In response to his inquiries on these points, however, Mr. Thomas Jefferson Haskins gave a clear and lucid explanation, which will be found in the next chapter. End of chapter 8. Recording by Red Abrus, July 2008. Chapter 9 of Saverine's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Red Abrus. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Saverine's Disappearance. Chapter 9. The Guest Creates a Sensation at the Royal Oak. "Well," said Haskins, "I didn't hear of you quite so far off as Nashville. It was when I was travelling in Kentucky buying horses last year. At Lexington I fell in with an English chap named Randall, who used to live in this neighbourhood. I hired him to buy horses for me. He was with me about 3 months, and if I could only have kept him sober he would have been with me yet, for he was about as keen a judge of a horse as ever I came across in my born days, and knew mighty well how to make a bargain. Well, we hadn't been together a week afore he begun to tell me about a place where he used to live in Canada West, where he said a little money went a long way, and where good horses could be bought cheap. He wanted me to send him up here to buy for me, and I don't know but I should have done it if I had found he was to be trusted. But he would drink like all creation when he had money. Old Bourbon was a thing he couldn't resist. He had an awful poor opinion of all the rest of our American institutions, and used to say they wanna on no account as compared to what he used to have to home in England. But when it came to Bourbon whiskey, he was full-mouthed as Uncle Henry Clay himself. He allowed there warn't anything either in England or in Canada to touch it, and when he got 4 or 5 inches of it inside him, there was no kidding along with him nohow. There warn't anything on earth he wouldn't do to get a couple of inches more, and when he got them, he was the catavamptuousest critter I ever did see. You couldn't place any more dependence on him than on a free nigger. Besides, he used to neglect his wife, and a man who neglects his wife ain't a man to trust with a couple of $1,000 at a time. No, sir, real not much he ain't, but as I was saying, the way he used to harp on this place of Lapierre's was a caution. Whenever we used to get planted down in one of our crossroad taverns, he would turn up his nose till you could see clean down his throat into his stomach. The fact is, our country taverns ain't up to much, and sometimes I could hardly stand 'em myself. When we'd come in after a hearty day's riding, and get sot down to a feed of heavy short cake and fat pork, then Randall would begin to blow about the grub up here at Lapierre's. He used to tell about the hot suppers served up here to a passel of farmers on Saturday nights till I most got sick o' hearing him. But I see your mugs are empty again, gentlemen. Landlord, please to do your duty and score it up to yours truly." During this long harangue, the assembled guests alternately scanned the speaker and each other with inquiring but vacant countenances. They were puzzling themselves to think who this Randall could be, as no man of that name had ever been known in that community. When Mr. Haskins paused in his discourse and gave his order for replenishment, Farmer Donaldson was about to remonstrate against this second treat at the expense of a stranger, and to propose that he himself should stand sponsor for the incoming refreshments. But before he could get out a word, the landlord suddenly sprang from his seat with a white, agitated face. "Tell me," he said, addressing the stranger, "what like is this Randall? Please describe his features." "Well," drawled the person addressed after a short pause, "there ain't much to describe about him. He's a tallish feller, fully 4 inches taller'n I be. He's broad and stout, a big man generally. Weighs, I should say, not much under 190. Rather light complected, and has a long cut in his face that shows awful white when he gets his back up. Thunder! He pretty nearly scared me with that gash one night when he was drunk. It seemed to open and shut like a clamshell, and made him look like a voodoo priest. You'd think the blood was going to spurt out by the yard." By this time every pair of eyes in the room was staring into the speaker's face with an expression of bewildered astonishment. Not a man there but recognized the description as a vivid, if somewhat exaggerated portraiture of the long-lost Reginald Bourchier Savareen. The stranger from Tennessee readily perceived that he had produced a genuine sensation. He gazed from one to another for a full minute without speaking. Then he gave vent to his surcharged feelings by the exclamation, "For the land's sake!" An air of speechless bewilderment still pervaded the entire group. They sat silent as statues, without motion and almost without breath. Lapierre was the first to recover himself. By a significant gesture he imposed continued silence upon the company and began to ask questions. He succeeded in eliciting some further pertinent information. Haskins was unable to say when Randall had acquired a familiarity with the ways and doings of the people residing in the vicinity of the Royal Oak, but it must have been some time ago, as he had lived in the States long enough to have become acquainted with various localities there. As to when and why he had left Canada, the stranger was also totally ignorant. He knew, however, that Randall was living in the city of New York about 3 months ago, as he had seen him there, and had visited him at his lodgings on Amity Street in May, when he, Haskins, had attended as a delegate to a sporting convention. At that time Randall had been employed in some capacity in Hitchcock's sale stable, and made a few dollars now and again by breeding dogs. He lived a needy, hand-to-mouth existence, and his poor wife had a hard time of it. His drinking habits prevented him from getting ahead in the world, and he never stayed long in one place. But the speaker had no doubt that he might still be heard of at Hitchcock's by anybody who wanted to hunt him up. "But," added Mr. Haskins, "I hope I haven't got him into trouble by coming here tonight. Has he done anything? Anything criminal, I mean?" After a moment's deliberation, Lapierre told the whole story. There was no doubt in the mind of any member of the company that Randall and Savareen were parts of one stupendous whole. The one important question for consideration was, what use ought to be made of the facts thus strangely brought to light. By this time supper was announced, and the stranger's news, exciting as it was, did not prevent the guests from doing ample justice to it. Haskins was loud in his praises of the spread, as he termed it. "Jack Randall," he remarked, "could lie when he had a mind to, but he told the holy truth when he bragged you up as far as ahead of the Kentucky cooks. Yes, I don't mind if I do take another morsel of that fricassee. Dog me if it don't beat canvas backs. Before the meeting broke up, it was agreed on all hands that for the present it would be advisable for the guests to allow the morrow to pass before saying anything to their wives or anyone else about Mr. Haskins' disclosures. It was further resolved that the gentleman should accompany Lapierre to Millbrook after breakfast in the morning, and that Mrs. Savareen's father should be made acquainted with the known facts. It was just possible, after all, that Jack Randall might be Jack Randall and not Savareen, in which case it was desirable to save the lost man's wife from cruel agitation to no purpose. It would be for her father, after learning all that they knew, to communicate the facts to her or to withhold them, as might seem best to him. On this understanding the company broke up on the stroke of midnight. I am by no means prepared to maintain that their pledges were in all cases kept, and that they each and every one went to sleep without taking their wives into confidence respecting the strange disclosures of the night. End of chapter 9. Recording by Red Abris. July 2008. Chapter 10 of Savareen's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Red Abris. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savareen's Disappearance. Chapter 10. Number 77, Amity Street. The next day was Sunday, but this circumstance did not deter Lapierre from hitching up his horse and conveying his guest down to Millbrook at an early hour. The pair called at the house of Mrs. Savareen's father before 10 o'clock, and had a long interview with him. Church services began at 11, but it was remarked by the Methodist congregation, and commented upon as a thing almost without precedent, that Mrs. Savareen and her father were both absent on that day. The old gentleman was much disturbed by what he heard from Mr. Haskins. His daughter had passed through an ordeal of great suffering, and had finally become reconciled to her lot. To tell her this news would be to open the old wounds afresh, and to bring back the domestic grief which time had about dispelled. Yet his course seemed clear. To tell her the truth was an imperative duty. It would be shameful to permit her to go on mourning for one who was in every way unworthy, and who might turn up at any unexpected moment to the destruction of her peace of mind. Moreover, the secret was already known to too many persons to admit of any hope that it would be permanently kept. She must be told, and there could be no question that her father was the proper person to tell her. She would, however, wish to personally see and converse with the man who had brought the news, so there was no time to be lost. Leaving his two visitors to await his return, the old man set out with a sad heart for his daughter's house. He found her and her little boy just ready to set out for church, but the first glance at her father's face told her that something had happened, and that there would be no church going for that day. She sat pale and trembling as she listened, and the old man himself was not much more composed. He broke the news as gently as he could, and she bore it better than he had expected, suppressing her agitation and taking in all the details without interruption. Even when all the circumstances had been laid before her, her self-command did not desert her. Yes, she must see the stranger from Tennessee. Possibly she might extract something from him which others had failed to elicit. Her father accordingly went back to his own home and brought Mr. Haskins over. The three spent several hours in talking of the affair, but the stranger had nothing more to tell, and finally took his leave, promising to call on his way back from Spotswood. Father and daughter spent the evening together, and tried to reach some definite conclusion as to what, if anything, ought to be done. There could be no reasonable doubt that Randall and Savareen were one. Since there was just the shadow of doubt, and the want of absolute certainty made it impossible for Mrs. Savareen to leave the matter as it stood, she felt that she must know the whole truth. A course was finally decided upon. Father and daughter would start for New York without delay and probe the matter to the bottom. The news could not wholly be kept from the stepmother, but she was enjoined to maintain a strict silence on the subject until further light should be thrown upon it. Master Reginald was temporarily left in her charge. They started for New York by the midday express on Monday, and reached their destination on Tuesday afternoon. Lodgings were secured at a quiet, respectable hotel, and then the old man set out alone to hunt up Hitchcock's stable. He had no difficulty in finding it, and the man in charge of the office readily gave him the information he sought. Jack Randall was no longer employed at the establishment, but he lodged with his wife at number 77 Amity Street. The best time to catch him at home was early in the morning. He was of a convivial turn, and generally spent his evenings about town. He was supposed to be pretty hard up, but that was his chronic condition, and so far as known he was not in absolute want. With these tidings the father returned to his daughter. Mrs. Savareen could not bear the idea of permitting the evening to pass without some further effort. She determined to pay a visit to 77 Amity Street in person, and if possible to see the man's wife for herself. A servant maid in the hotel undertook to pilot her to her destination, which was but a short distance away. It was about 8 o'clock when she set out, and the light of the day was fast disappearing. Upon reaching the corner of Amity Street and Broadway, she dismissed her attendant and made the rest of the journey alone. The numbers on the doors of the houses were a sufficient direction for her, and she soon found herself ringing at the bell of 77. Her summons was answered by a seedy-looking porter. Yes, Mrs. Randall was upstairs in her room on the third story. Mr. Randall was out. The lady could easily find the way for herself. Second door to the left on the third flat. Straight up. And so saying, the man disappeared into the darkness at the rear of the house, leaving the visitor to grope her way up two dimly lighted stairways as best she could. The place was evidently a lodging house of very inferior description, to be so near the palatial temples of commerce just round the corner. The halls were uncarpeted, and indeed without the least sign of furniture of any sort, and Mrs. Savareen slowly ascended one flight of stairs after another. She began to wonder if she had not done an unwise thing in venturing alone into a house and locality of which she knew nothing. Having reached the third story, she found herself in total darkness, except for such a faint twilight as found its way through a back window. This, however, was just sufficient to enable her to perceive the second door on the left. She advanced towards it and knocked. A female voice responded by an invitation to enter. She quietly turned the knob of the door and advanced into the room. End of chapter 10. Recording by Red Abris, July 2008.
Chapter 11 of Savareen's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savareen's Disappearance. Chapter 11. An Interview by Candlelight. The apartment in which the bold discoverer in an unknown sea found herself presented an appearance far from cheerful or attractive. It was of small dimensions, but too large for the meagre supply of furniture it contained. The unpapered walls displayed a monotonous surface of bare whitewash, in urgent need of renewal. In one corner was an impoverished-looking bed, on which reposed an infant of a few months old. At the foot of the bed was a cheap toilet stand with its accessories. In the adjacent corner was a door, apparently opening into a closet or inner receptacle of some kind, against which was placed a battered leather trunk with a broken hasp. A small table of stained pine, without any covering, stood near the middle of the room, and 2 or 3 common wooden chairs were distributed here and there against the walls. The faint light of expiring day found admission by means of a window looking out upon the roofs of the rear of the house. The only artificial light consisted of a solitary candle placed on the table, at the far end of which sat a woman engaged in sewing. The light, dim and ineffectual as it was, served to show that this woman was in a state of health which her friends, if she had any, must have deemed to be anything but satisfactory. It was easy to perceive that she had once possessed an attractive and rather pretty face. Some portion of her attractiveness still remained, but the beauty had been washed away by privation and misery, leaving behind nothing but a faint simulacrum of its former self. She was thin and fragile to the point of emaciation, insomuch that her print dress hung upon her as loosely as a morning wrapper. Her cheeks were sunken and hollow, and 2 dark patches beneath a pair of large blue eyes plainly indicated serious nervous waste. In addition to these manifest signs of a low state of bodily health, her pinched features had a worn, weary expression which told a sad tale of long and continuous suffering. Most of these things her visitor, with feminine quickness of perception, took in at the first momentary glance, and any preconceived feeling of hostility which may have had a place in her heart gave way to a sentiment of womanly sympathy. Clearly enough, any display of jealous anger would be wholly out of place in such a presence and situation. Mrs. Savareen had not given much preconsideration as to her line of action during the impending interview. She had merely resolved to be guided by circumstances, and what she saw before her made her errand one of some difficulty. Her main object, of course, was to ascertain, beyond the possibility of doubt, whether the man calling himself Jack Randall was the man known to her as Reginald Bourchier Savareen. The tenant of the room rose as her visitor entered, and even that slight exertion brought on a hollow cough which was pitiful to hear. "I am sorry to see," gently remarked the visitor, "that you are far from well." "Yes," was the reply, "I've got a cold and ain't very smart. Take a chair." And so saying, she placed a chair in position and made a not ungraceful motion towards it with her hand. Mrs. Savareen sat down and began to think what she would say next. Her hostess saved her from much thought on the matter by inquiring whether she had called to see Mr. Randall. "Yes," replied Mrs. Savareen, "I would like to see him for a few moments, if convenient." "Well, I am sorry he's out, and I don't suppose he'll be in for some time. He's generally out in the fore part of the evening, but he's most always home in the morning. Is it anything I can tell him?" Here was a nice complication. Had Mrs. Savareen been a student of Molière, the fitting reply to such a question under such circumstances would doubtless have risen to her lips. But I shrewdly suspect that she had never heard of the famous Frenchman, whose works were probably an unknown quantity in Millbrook in those days. After a momentary hesitation, she fenced with the question, and put one in her turn. "Do you know if he has heard from his friends in Hertfordshire lately?" "Hertfordshire? Oh, that is the place he comes from in the old country.
"No, he never hears from there. I have often wanted him to write to his friends in England, but he says it is so long since he left that they have forgotten all about him." Her speaker was interrupted by another fit of coughing. "No," she resumed, "he never even wrote to England to tell his friends when we were married. He was only a boy when he left home, and he was a good many years in Canada before he came over to the States." Just at this point it seemed to occur to Mrs. Randall that she was talking rather freely about her husband to a person whom she did not know, and she pulled herself up with a rather short turn. She looked intently into her visitor's face for a moment, as though with an inward monition that something was wrong. "But," she resumed, after a brief pause, "do you know my husband? I can't remember as I've ever seen you before. You don't live in New York, I can see that. I guess you come from the West?" Then Mrs. Savareen felt that some explanation was necessary. She fairly took the animal by the extreme tip of his horns. "Yes," she responded, "I live in the West, and I have only been in New York a very short time. I accidentally heard that Mr. Randall lived here, and I wish to ascertain if he is the same gentleman I once knew in Canada. If he is, there is something of importance I should like to tell him. Would you be so kind as to describe his personal appearance for me?" The woman again inspected her very carefully, with eyes not altogether free from suspicion. "I don't exactly understand," she exclaimed. "You don't want to do him any harm, do you? You haven't got anything agin him? We are in deep enough trouble as it is." The last words were uttered in a tone very much resembling a wail of despair. By this time the visitor's sympathies were thoroughly aroused on behalf of the poor creature before her. She felt that she had not the heart to add to the burden of grief which had been imposed upon the frail woman who sat there eyeing her with anxiety depicted upon her weary, anxious face. "I can assure you," responded Mrs. Savareen, "that I have no intention of doing any harm either to him or to you. I would much rather do you a kindness if I could. I can see for myself that you stand in great need of kindness." The last words were spoken in a tone which disarmed suspicion and which at the same time stimulated curiosity. The shadow on Mrs. Randall's face passed away. "Well," she said, "I beg your pardon for mistrusting you, but my husband has never told me much about his past life, and I was afraid you might be an enemy. But I am sure, now I look at you, that you wouldn't do harm to anybody. I'll tell you whatever you want to know, if I can." "Thank you for your good opinion. Will you be good enough, then, to describe Mr. Randall's personal appearance? I have no other object than to find out if he is the person I used to know in Canada." "How long did you know him in Canada?" "I saw him last in the summer of 1854, about 5 years ago." "Well, at that rate I've known him pretty near as long as you have. It's more'n 4 years since I first got acquainted with him in old Virginny, where I was raised. Why, come to think of it, I've got his likeness, took just before he was married. That'll show you whether he's the man you knew." As she spoke she rose and opened the leather trunk in the corner by the closet door. After rummaging among its contents, she presently returned with a small oval daguerreotype in her hand. Opening the case, she handed it to Mrs. Savareen. "There he is," she remarked, "and it's considered an awful good likeness." Mrs. Savareen took the daguerreotype and approached the candle. The first glance was amply sufficient. It was the likeness of her husband. She made up her mind as to her line of action on the instant. Her love for the father of her child died away as she gazed on his picture. It was borne in upon her that he was a heartless scoundrel, unworthy of any woman's regard. Before she withdrew her glance from the daguerreotype, her love for him was dead and buried beyond all possibility of revivification. What would it avail her to still further lacerate the heart of the unhappy woman in whose presence she stood? Why kill her outright by revealing the truth? There was but a step, and evidently the step was a short one, between her and the grave. The distance should not be abridged by any act of the lawful wife. She closed the case and quietly handed it back to the woman whom it will still be convenient to call Mrs. Randall. "I see there has been some misunderstanding," she said. "This is not the Mr. Randall I knew in Canada." In her consideration for the invalid she deliberately conveyed a false impression, though she spoke nothing more than the simple truth. There had indeed been some misunderstanding, and Savareen's likeness was certainly not the likeness of Mr. Randall. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Savareen had really known a Mr. Randall in Millbrook who bore no resemblance whatever to her husband. Thus she spoke the literal truth, while she at the same time deceived her hostess for the latter's own good. Affliction had laid its blighting hand there heavily enough already. Her main object now was to get away from the house before the return of the man who had so villainously wrecked two innocent lives. But a warm sympathy for the betrayed and friendless woman had sprung up in her heart, and she longed to leave behind some practical token of her sympathy. While she was indulging in these reflections, the infant on the bed awoke and set up a startled little cry. Its mother advanced to where it lay, took it up in her arms, sat down on the edge of the bed, and stilled its forlorn little wails by the means known to mothers from time immemorial. When it became quiet, she again deposited it on the bed and resumed her seat by the table. Mrs. Savareen continued standing. "I am sorry to have disturbed you unnecessarily," she remarked, "and will now take my leave. Is there anything I can do for you? I should be glad if I could be of any use to you. I am afraid you are not very comfortably off, and you are far from well in health. It is not kind of Mr. Randall to leave you alone like this. You need rest and medical advice." These were probably the first sympathetic words Mrs. Randall had heard from one of her own sex for many a long day. The tears started in her tired eyes as she replied, "I guess there ain't no rest for me this side of the grave. I haven't any money to get medical advice, and I don't suppose a doctor could do me any good. I am pretty well run down, and so is the baby. I'm told it can't live long, and if it was only laid to rest, I wouldn't care how soon my time came. You're right about our being awful hard up, but don't you be too hard on my husband. He has his own troubles as well as me. He hain't got no cash lately, and don't seem able to get none." "But he could surely stay at home and keep you company at nights when you are so ill. It must be very lonely for you." "Well, you see, I ain't much company for him. He's been brought up different to what I have, and's been used to having things comfortable. I ain't strong enough to do much of anything myself, with a sick baby. I'm sure I don't know what's to be the end of it all. As a general thing, he don't mean to be unkind, but—" Here the long-suffering woman utterly broke down and was convulsed by a succession of sobs, which seemed to exhaust the small stock of vitality left to her. The visitor approached the chair where she sat, knelt by her side, and took the poor wasted form in her arms. They mingled their tears together. For some time neither of them was able to speak, but the sympathy of the stronger of the two acted like a cordial upon her weaker sister, who gradually became calm and composed. The sobs died away, and the shattered frame ceased to tremble. Then they began to talk. Mrs. Savareen's share in the conversation was chiefly confined to a series of sympathetic questions, whereby she extracted such particulars as furnished a key to the present situation. It appeared that the soi-disant Jack Randall had made the acquaintance of his second victim within a short time after his departure from Canada. He had then been engaged in business on his own account as a dealer in horses in Lexington, Kentucky, where the father of the woman whose life he had afterwards blighted kept a tavern. He had made soft speeches to her and had won her heart, although even then she had not been blind to his main defect, a fondness for old bourbon. After a somewhat protracted courtship she had married him, but the sun of prosperity had never shone upon them after their marriage, for his drinking habit had grown upon him, and he had soon got to the end of what little money he had. He had been compelled to give up business and to take service with anyone who would employ him. Then matters had gone from bad to worse. He had been compelled to move about from one town to another, for his habits would not admit of his continuing long in any situation. She had accompanied him wherever he went with true wifely devotion, but had been constrained to drink deeply of the cup of privation, and had never been free from anxiety. About 6 months ago they had come to New York, where he had at first found fairly remunerative employment in Hitchcock's sales stable. But there, as elsewhere, he had wrecked his prospects by drink and neglect of business, and for some time past the unhappy pair had been entirely destitute. The baby had been born soon after they had taken up their quarters in New York. The mother's health, which had been far from strong before this event, completely broke down, and she had never fully recovered. The seeds of consumption, which had probably been implanted in her before her birth, had rapidly developed themselves under the unpromising regimen to which she had been subjected, and it was apparent that she had not long to live. She was unable to afford proper nourishment to her child, which languished from day to day, and the only strong desire left to her was that she might survive long enough to see it fairly out of the world. Such was the sad tale poured into the sympathetic ears of Mrs. Savareen as she knelt there with the poor creature's head against her bosom. She, for the time, lost sight of her own share in the misery brought about by the man who, in the eye of the law, was still her husband. She spoke such words of comfort and consolation as suggested themselves to her, but the case was a hopeless one, and it was evident that no permanent consolation could ever again find a lodgment in the breast of the woman who supposed herself to be Mrs. Randall. The best that was left to her in this world was to hear the sad rites pronounced over her babe, and then to drop gently away into that long last sleep, wherein, it was to be hoped, she would find the calm repose which a cruel fate had denied her so long as she remained on earth. Mrs. Savareen, it will be remembered, was a pious woman. In such a situation as that in which she found herself, we may feel sure that she did not omit all reference to the consolations of religion. She poured into the ear of this sore tried soul a few of those words at which thinkers of the modern school are wont to sneer, but which for 18 centuries have brought balm to the suffering and the afflicted of every clime. Moreover, she did not neglect to administer consolation of a material kind. She emptied her purse into the invalid's lap. It contained something like $30, more money probably than Mrs. Randall had ever called her own before. "Keep this for your own use," she said. "It will buy many little comforts for you and baby. No, I will not take any of it back. I am comfortably off and shall not want it." Then, with a final embrace and a few hurried words of farewell, she stepped to the bedside and imprinted a kiss on the little waif lying there, all unconscious of the world of sin and sorrow in which it held so precarious a dwelling place. Her mission was at an end. She silently passed from the room, closing the door behind her. End of chapter 11.
Chapter 12 of Savareen's disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savareen's disappearance. Chapter 12. Still a mystery. At the head of the stairway she paused for a moment to collect herself before passing down and out into the street. What she had left behind her was of a nature well fitted to excite emotion, and her bosom rose and fell with gentle tenderness and pity. But she had learned self-control in the school of experience, and her delay was a brief one. Mastering her emotions, she walked steadily down the 2 flights of stairs, opened the front door for herself, and was just about to cross the threshold when a man entered. The light of the street lamp fell full upon his face. It was the face of the man whose mysterious disappearance 5 years before had created such a profound sensation throughout Western Canada. There was no possibility of mistaking it, though it was greatly changed for the worse. 5 years had wrought terrible havoc upon it. The scar on the left cheek was more conspicuous than of yore, and the features seemed to have settled into a perpetual frown. But worst of all, the countenance was bloated and besotted. The nose had become bulbous and spongy, the eyes watery and weak. The man's clothes were patched and seedy, and presented a general aspect of being desperately out at elbows. His unsteady step indicated that he was at least half drunk at that moment. He did not see, or at any rate did not take any notice of the woman who gazed into his face so intently. And as he staggered on his way upstairs, he stumbled and narrowly escaped falling. Could it be possible that this disreputable object was the man whom she had once loved as her husband? She shuddered as she passed out onto the pavement. Truly, his sin had found him out. She had no difficulty in finding her way back to the hotel without asking questions of anybody. Upon reaching it, she conferred for a moment with the office clerk, and then passed up to a small general sitting room where she found her father. The old gentleman was beginning to be anxious at her long absence. "Well, father, I find there is an express for Suspension Bridge at midnight. I think we'd better take it. It is now 10:30. I have learned all I want to know, and there is no use for us to stay here on expense. But perhaps you are tired and would like a night's rest." "Found out all you wanted to know? Do you mean to say you have seen him?" "Yes, and I never wish to see or hear of him again in this world. Don't question me now. I will tell you all before we get home, and after that I hope you will never mention his name in my presence. When shall we start?" Finding her really anxious to be gone, the old man assented to her proposition, and they started on their way homeward by midnight train. They reached Millbrook in due course, the father having meanwhile been informed of all that his daughter had to tell him. Savareen's disappearance remained as profound a mystery to them as ever, but it had at any rate been made clear that he had absconded of his own free will, and that in doing so he must have exercised a good deal of shrewdness and cunning. The question as to how far it was advisable to take the public into their confidence exercised the judgment of both father and daughter. The conclusion arrived at was that as little as possible should be said about the matter. Their errand to New York was already known, and could not be wholly ignored.
The fact of Savareen's existence would have to be admitted. It would inevitably be chronicled by the Sentinel, and the record would be transferred to the columns of other newspapers. The subject would be discussed among the local quidnuncs, and the excitement of 5 years since would, to some extent, be revived. All this must naturally be expected, and would have to be endured as best it might. But it was resolved that people should not be encouraged to ask questions, and that they should be made to understand that the topic was not an agreeable one to the persons immediately concerned. It might reasonably be hoped that gossip would sooner or later wear itself out. For the present it would be desirable for Mrs. Savareen to keep within doors and to hold as little communication with her neighbors as possible. This program was strictly adhered to, and everything turned out precisely as had been expected. Mr. Haskins reached Millbrook on his way home to Tennessee within a day or two after the return of father and daughter from New York. He was informed by the father that Randall and Savareen were identical, but that the family wished to suppress all talk about the fair as far as possible. He took the hint and departed on his way homeward without seeking to probe further into matters in which he had no personal concern. It was hardly to be supposed, however, that the local population would show equal forbearance. Curiosity was widespread, and was not to be suppressed from a mere sentiment of delicacy. No sooner did it become known that the father and daughter had returned than the former was importuned by numerous friends and acquaintances to disclose the result of his journey. He so far responded to these importunities as to admit that the missing man was living in the States under an assumed name, but he added that neither his daughter nor himself was inclined to talk about the matter. He said, in effect, "My daughter's burden is a heavy one to bear, and anyone who has any consideration for either her or me will never mention the matter in the presence of either of us. Anyone who does so will thereby forfeit all right to be regarded as a friend or well-wisher." This did not silence gossiping tongues, but it at least prevented them from propounding their questions directly to himself. He was promptly interviewed by the editor of the Sentinel, who received exactly the same information as other people and no more. The next number of the paper contained a leading article on the subject, in which the silence of Mrs. Savareen and her father was animadverted upon. The public, it was said, were entitled to be told all that there was to tell. Savareen's disappearance had long since become public property, and the family were not justified in withholding any information which might tend to throw light on that dark subject. This article was freely copied by other papers, and for several weeks the topic was kept conspicuously before the little world of Western Canada. Nowhere was the interest in the subject more keenly manifested than at the Royal Oak, where it furnished the theme of frequent and all but interminable discussion. Not a day passed but mine host Lapierre publicly congratulated himself upon his acumen in having all along believed and declared that Savareen was still in the land of the living. This landlord shared the prevalent opinion that the family should be more communicative. "I have always," he said, "been a good friend to Mrs. Savareen. I respect her very much, but I think she might let us know some things more about her discoveries in New York." Scores of other persons harped to the same monotonous tune, but father and daughter submitted to this as to a necessary penalty of their situation, and by degrees the excitement quieted down. I am not prepared to say whether the stepmother received further enlightenment than other people, but if she did, she kept her tongue between her teeth like a sensible woman. As for Mrs. Savareen herself, she consistently refrained from speaking on the subject to anyone,
and even the most inveterate gossips showed sufficient respect for her feelings to ask her no questions. She held the even tenor of her way, doing her work and maintaining herself as usual, but she lived a secluded life, and was seldom seen outside her own house. Thus several months passed away without the occurrence of any event worthy of being recorded. The mystery of Savareen's disappearance remained a mystery still, but the time was approaching when all that had so long been dark was to be made clear, and when the strange problem of 5 years before was to be solved. End of chapter 12. Reading by Bob Sage. Chapter 13 of Savareen's disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savareen's Disappearance. Chapter 13. Coals of Fire. The gloomy month of November, 1859, was drawing to its close. The weather, as usual at that time of the year, was dull and sober, and the skies were dark and lowering. More than 3 months had elapsed since the journey to New York, and Mrs. Savareen and her affairs had ceased to be the engrossing topics of discussion among the people of Millbrook and its neighborhood. She continued to live a very secluded life, and seldom stirred beyond the threshold of her own door. Almost her only visitors were her father and brother, for her stepmother rarely intruded upon her domain, and indeed was not much encouraged to do so, as her presence never brought comfort with it. The little boy continued to grow apace, and it seemed to the fond mother that he became dearer to her every day. He was the sole light and joy of her life, and in him were bound up all her hopes for the future. Of late she had ceased to scan his features in the hope of tracing there some resemblance of his absent father. Since her visit to Amity Street, that fond illusion had wholly departed, never to return. She had ceased even to speak to him about his other parent, and had begun to regard herself in the light of an actual widow. Such was the state of affairs when the humdrum of her existence was broken in upon by a succession of circumstances which it now becomes necessary to unfold. It was rapidly drawing towards 6 o'clock in the evening, and the darkness of night had already fallen upon the outer landscape. Mrs. Savareen sat in her little parlor with her boy upon her knee, as it was her custom to sit at this hour. The lamp had not been lighted, but the fireplace sent forth a ruddy blaze, making the countless shadows reflect themselves on the floor and in the remote corners of the room. To both the boy and the child this hour, between the dark and the daylight, was incomparably the most delightful of the 24, for it was consecrated to story-telling. Then it was that the boy was first introduced to those old-time legends which in one form or another have thrilled the bosoms of happy childhood for so many hundreds of years, and which will continue to thrill them through centuries yet unborn. Then it was that he made the acquaintance of Little Red Riding Hood, Jack the Giant Killer, and the 7 champions of Christendom. The mingled lights and shades from the blazing logs of hickory in the fireplace lent additional charm to the 1,001 stories which the mother recounted for the child's edification. And I doubt not that Jack's wonderful beanstalk is still associated in Master Reggie's mind with that cozy little room, with its blended atmosphere of cheerful twilight and sombre shadow. A few minutes more and it would be tea time. It would never do, however, to break off the story of the babes in the wood just at the time when the 2 emissaries of the wicked uncle began to quarrel in the depths of the forest. The child's sympathies had been thoroughly aroused, and he would not tamely submit to be left in suspense. No, the gruesome old tale must be told out, or at least as far as where the robin redbreasts, after mourning over the fate of the hapless infants, did cover them with leaves. And so the mother went on with the narrative. She had just reached the culminating point when an approaching footstep was heard outside. Then came a knock at the door, followed by the entrance of Mrs. Savareen's father. It was easy to see from his face that this was no mere perfunctory call. Evidently he had news to tell. "Something has happened, father?" said Mrs. Savareen as calmly as she could. "Well, yes, something has happened. It is nothing very dreadful, but you had better prepare yourself to hear unpleasant news. It is that man. He has come." "Yes, he has come to town." "Is he at the door?" "No, he is at my house. I thought I had better come over and tell you, instead of letting him come himself and take you by surprise." "What has he come for, and what does he want?" inquired Mrs. Savareen in a harder tone of voice than she was accustomed to use. "Well, for one thing, he wants to see you, and I suppose you can't very well avoid seeing him. He is your husband, you know. He knows nothing about the journey to New York. He has no means and looks shabby and sickly. I shouldn't wonder if he isn't long for this world." "So you didn't tell him anything about the New York trip?" "No, I didn't exactly know what your views might be, and he looked such a worn-out, pitiful object that I held my tongue about it. I think you had better see him and hear what he has to say." It appeared that Savareen had arrived at Millbrook by the 4:15 p.m. train from New York, and that he had slunk round by the least frequented streets to his father-in-law's house without being recognized by anyone. It might be doubted, indeed, whether any of his old friends would have recognized him, even if they had met him face to face in broad daylight, for he was by no means the ruddy, robust, self-complacent-looking personage that they had been accustomed to see in the old days, when he was wont to ride into town on his black mare. His clothes were seamy and worn, and his physical proportions had shrunk so much that the shabby garments seemed a world too wide for him. His face, which 3 months ago had been bloated and sodden, had become pale and emaciated, and the scar upon his left cheek seemed to have developed until it was the most noticeable thing about him. His step was feeble and tremulous, and it was evident that his health had completely broken down. He was in fact in a state bordering on collapse, and was hardly fit to be going about. His financial condition was on a par with his bodily state. He had expended his last dime in the purchase of his railway ticket, and at the moment of reaching his father-in-law's door he had been well nigh famished for want of food. When a loaf of bread and some slices of cold meat had been set before him, he had fallen to with the voracity of a jungle tiger. He had vouchsafed no explanation of his presence, except that he felt he was going to die, and that he wanted to see his wife and child. As he was tired out and sorely in need of rest, he had been put to bed, and his father-in-law, after seeing him snugly stowed away between the sheets, had set out to bear the news to his wife. There could be no doubt as to what was the proper thing to be done. Mrs. Savareen made the fire safe, put on her bonnet and shawl, and locked up the house. Then, taking her little boy by the hand, she accompanied her father to the old house where, 6 or 7 years before, the handsome young farmer had been in the habit of visiting and paying court to her. On arriving, she found the invalid buried in the deep, profound sleep of exhaustion. Consigning her boy to the care of her stepmother, she took her place by the bedside and waited. Her vigil was a protracted one, for the tired-out sleeper did not awaken until the small hours of the next morning. Then, with a long drawn respiration, he opened his eyes and fixed them upon the watcher with a weak, wandering expression, as though he was unable to fully grasp the situation. The truth found its way to him by degrees. He shifted himself uneasily, as though he would have been glad to smother himself beneath the bedclothes, was it not for a lack of resolution. A whipped hound never presented a more abject appearance. His wife was the first to speak. "Do you feel rested?" she asked in a gentle tone. "Rested? Oh, yes, I remember now. We are at your father's." "Yes, but don't talk any more just now, if it tires you. Try to go to sleep again." "You are good to me, better than I deserve," he responded after a pause. Then great tears welled up to his eyes and coursed one after another down his thin, worn face. It was easy to see that he was weak as water. His long journey by rail without food had been too much for him, and in his state of health it was just possible he might never rally. The womanly nature of the outraged wife came uppermost, as it always does under such circumstances. Her love for the miserable creature lying there before her had been killed and crucified long ago, never to be revived. But she could not forget that she had once loved him, and that he was the father of her child. No matter how deeply he had wronged her, he was ill and suffering, perhaps dying. His punishment had come upon him without any act of hers. She contrasted his present bearing with that of other days. He was bent, broken, crushed. Nothing there to remind her of the stalwart, manly young fellow whose voice had once stirred her pulse to admiration and love. All the more reason why she should be good to him now, all undeserving as he might be. Our British Homer showed a true appreciation of the best side of feminine nature when he wrote, "O woman, in our hour of ease, uncertain, coy, and hard to please, when pain and anguish wring thy brow, a ministering angel thou." She rose and approached the bed, while her gaze rested mildly upon his face. Drawing forth her handkerchief, she wiped the salt tears from his cheeks with a caressing hand. To him, lying there in his helplessness, she seemed no unfit earthly representative of that divine beneficence whose blessed task, says Thackeray, it will one day be to wipe the tear from every eye. Her gentleness caused the springs to well forth afresh, and the prostrate form was convulsed by sobs. She sat by his side on the bed and staunched the miniature flood with a tender touch. By and by calm returned, and he sank into a profound and apparently dreamless sleep. When he again awoke it was broad daylight. The first object on which his eyes rested was the patient watcher who had never left her post the whole night long, and who still sat in an armchair at his bedside, ready to minister to his comfort. As soon as she perceived that he was awake, she approached and took his wasted hand in her own. He gazed steadily in her face, but could find no words to speak. "You are rested now, are you not?" she murmured, scarcely above her breath. After a while he found his voice, and asked how long he had slept. Being enlightened on the point, he expressed his belief that it was time for him to rise. "Not yet," was the response. "You shall have your breakfast first, and then it will be time enough to think about getting up. I forbid you to talk until you have had something to eat," she added playfully. "Lie still for a few minutes while I go and see about a cup of tea." And so saying, she left him to himself. Presently she returned, bearing a tray and eatables. She quietly raised him to a sitting posture and placed a large soft pillow at his back. He submitted to her ministrations like a child. It was long since he had been tended with such care, and the position doubtless seemed a little strange to him. After drinking a cup of tea and eating several morsels of the good things set before him, he evidently felt refreshed. His eyes lost somewhat of their lack-lustre air of confirmed invalidism, and his voice regained a measure of its natural tone. When he attempted to rise and dress himself, however, he betrayed such a degree of bodily feebleness that his wife forbade him to make further exertions. He yielded to her importunities and remained in bed, which was manifestly the best place for him. He was pestered by no unnecessary questions to account for his presence, Mrs. Savareen rightly considering that it was for him to volunteer any explanations he might have to make whenever he felt equal to the task. After a while his little boy was brought in to see his father, of whom he dimly remembered to have heard. His presence moved the sick man to further exhibitions of tearful sensibility, but seemed, on the whole, to have a salutary effect. Long absence and a vagabond life had not quenched the paternal instinct, and the little fellow was caressed with a fervour too genuine to admit of the possibility of its being assumed. Master Reggie received these ebullitions of affection without much corresponding demonstrativeness. He could not be expected to feel any vehement adoration for one whom he had never seen since his earliest babyhood, and whose very name for some months past had been permitted to sink out of sight. His artless prattle, however, was grateful in the ears of his father, who looked and listened as if entranced by sweet strains of music. His wasted, worse than wasted, past seemed to rise before him as the child's accents fell softly upon his ear, and he seemed to realize more than ever how much he had thrown away. In the course of the forenoon Mrs. Savareen's stepmother took her place in the sick chamber, and she herself withdrew to another room, to take the rest of which she was by this time sorely in need. The invalid would not assent to the proposal to call in a physician. He declared that he was only dead tired, and that rest and quiet would soon restore him without medicine, in so far as any restoration was possible. And so the day passed. By the evening the wife again took her place at the bedside, and she had not been there long ere her husband, voluntarily, began his chapter of explanations. His story was a strange one, but there was no room to doubt the truth of any portion of it. End of chapter 13. Reading by Bob Sage.
Chapter 14 of Savareen's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savareen's Disappearance. Chapter 14. The Bad Half-Crown. He began by comparing himself to the bad half-crown, which always finds its way back, but which has no right to expect a warm welcome on its return. "Were it not," he said, "that I feel myself to be pretty near the end of my earth's journey, I could not have the face to tell you my story at all. But I feel that I am worn out, and don't think it likely that I shall ever leave this room except for the grave. You shall know everything, even more fully than I have ever known it myself until within the last few hours. They say that when a man is nearing his end, he sees more clearly than at any other time of his life. For my part, I now see for the first time that I have never been anything but a worthless lout from my cradle. I have never been fit to walk alone, and if health and strength were to come back to me, I should not be one whit better than I have hitherto been. I don't know whether I ever told you that I have a streak of gypsy blood in my veins. My grandmother was a Romany, picked up by my grandfather on Wandsworth Common. I don't offer this fact as any excuse for my conduct, but I have sometimes thought that it may have something to do with the pronounced vagabondism which has always been one of my most distinctive features. So long as I was at home in my father's house, he kept me from doing anything very outrageous, but I was always a creature of impulse, ready to enter into any harebrained scheme without counting the cost. I never looked a week ahead in my life. It was sufficient for me if the present was endurable, and if the general outlook for the future promised something new. My coming to this country in the first place was a mere impulse, inspired by a senseless liking for adventure and a wish to see strange faces and scenes. My taking Squire Harrington's farm was an impulse, very largely due to its proximity to Lapierre's, who is a jolly landlord and knows how to make his guests comfortable. I had no special aptitude for farm life, no special desire to get on in the world, no special desire to do anything except pass the time as pleasantly as I could, without thought or care for the future. And as I have fully made up my mind to make a clean breast of it, I am going to tell you something which will make you despise me more than you have ever despised me yet. When I married you, I did so from impulse. Don't mistake me. I liked you better than any other woman I had ever seen. I liked your pretty face and your gentle, girlish ways. I knew that you were good and would make an excellent wife. But I well knew that I had no such feeling toward you as a man should have towards the woman whom he intends to make the companion of his life. No such feeling, for instance, as I have for you at this moment. Well, I married you, and we lived together as happily as most young couples do. I knew that I had a good wife, and you didn't know or even suspect what a brainless, heartless clod you had for your husband. Our married life glided by without anything particular happening to disturb it, but the thing became monotonous to me. I had the senseless vagabond's desire for change. We did fairly well on the farm, but once or twice I was on the point of proposing to you that we should emigrate to the Western States. I began to drink more than was good for me, and 2 or 3 times when I came home half seas over, you reproached me and looked at me in a way I didn't like. This I inwardly resented like the besotted fool I was. It seemed to me that you might have held your tongue. The feeling wasn't a very strong one with me, and if it hadn't been for that cursed £400, things might have gone on for some time longer. Of course, I kept all this to myself, for I was at least sensible enough to feel ashamed of my want of purpose, and knew that I deserved to be horsewhipped for not caring more for you and baby. The legacy from my father, if properly used, would have placed us on our feet. With a farm of my own, I might reasonably hope to become a man of more importance in our community than I had been. For a time this was the only side of the picture that presented itself to my mind. I began to contemplate myself as a landed proprietor, and the contemplation was pleasant enough. I bought the farm from Squire Harrington in good faith, and with no other intention than to carry out the transaction. When I left home on the morning of that 17th of July, I had no more intention of absconding than I now have of running for Parliament. The idea never so much as entered my mind. The morning was wet, and it seemed likely that we should have a rainy day. I was in a more loaferish mood than usual.
and thought I might as well ride to town to pass the time. The hired man, whose name I have forgotten, was not within call at the moment, so I went out to the stable to saddle Black Bess for myself. Then I found that the inner front padding of the saddle had been torn by rats during the night, and that the metal plate was exposed. To use it in that state would have galled the mare's back, and it was necessary to place something beneath it. I looked about me in the stable, but saw nothing suitable, so I returned into the house to get some kind of an old cloth for the purpose. If you had been there, I should have asked for what I wanted, but you were not to be seen, and when I called out your name, you did not answer. Then, in a fit of momentary stupid petulance, I went into the front bedroom, opened my trunk, and took out the first thing that came uppermost. I should have taken and used it for what I wanted just then, even if it had been a silk dress or a petticoat, but it happened to be a coat of my own. I took it out to the stable, placed it under the saddle, and rode off. Before reaching the front gate, I saw how it was that you had not answered my call, for, as you doubtless remembered, you were in the orchard with baby in your arms at some distance from the house. I nodded to you as I rode past, little thinking that years would elapse before I should see you again. I suppose you know all about how I spent the day. I had a bit of a quarrel with the clerk at the bank, and that put me out of humor. I had not intended to draw the money, but to leave it on deposit till next morning. Shuttleworth's ill-tempered remarks nettled me. I took the notes in a huff and left the bank with them in my pocket. I ought to have sense enough to ride home at once, but I went to the Peacock and muddled myself with drink. I felt elated to have such a large sum of money about me. I carried on like a fool and a sot all afternoon. I didn't start for home till a few minutes before dark. Up to that moment the idea of clearing out had never presented itself to my mind, but as I cantered along the quiet road, I began to think what a good time I could have with £400 in my pocket in some far-off place where I was not known, and where I should be free from encumbrances of every kind. In the half befuddled condition in which I then was, the idea quickly took possession of my stupid imagination. I rode along, however, without coming to any fixed determination, till I reached Jonathan Perry's toll gate. I exchanged a few words with him, and then resumed my journey. Suddenly it flashed upon me that if I was really going to make a strike for it, nothing was to be gained by delaying my flight. What was the use of going home? If I ever got there, I should probably be unable to summon up sufficient resolution to go at all. Just then I heard the sound of horses' feet advancing rapidly down the road. An impulse seized me to get out of the way, but to do this was not easy. There was a shallow ditch along each side of the road, and the fence was too high for a leap. Before I could let down the rails and betake myself for the fields, the horseman would be on the spot. As I cast rapid glances this way and that, I came in front of the gateway of the lane leading down to the side of Stolliver's house, to his barnyard, and as it happened, the gate was open. On came the horse, clattering down the road, and not a second was to be lost if I wished to remain unseen. I rode in, dismounted, shut to the gate, and led my mare a few yards down the lane to an overhanging black cherry, beneath which I ensconced myself. Scarcely had I taken up my position there when the horse and his rider passed at a swift trot down the road. It was too dark for me to tell at that distance who the rider was, but, as you shall hear, I soon found out. I stood still and silent, with my hand on Bess's mane, cogitating what to do next.
While I did so, Stolliver's front door opened, and he and his boys walked out to the front fence, where the old man lighted his pipe. Then I heard the horse and his rider coming back up the road from the toll gate. In another moment the rider drew up and began to talk to Stolliver. I listened with breathless attention and heard every word of the conversation, which related to myself. I feared that Bess would neigh or paw the ground, in which case the attention of the speakers would have been drawn to my whereabouts. But as my cursed fate would have it, the mare made no demonstration of any kind, and I was completely hidden from view by the darkness and also by the foliage of the cherry tree under which I stood. The horseman, as you probably know, was Lapierre, who had been dispatched by you to bring me home. This proceeding on your part I regarded, in my then frame of mind, in the light of an indignity. A pretty thing, truly, if I was to be treated as though I was unable to take care of myself, and if my own wife was to send people to hunt for me about the neighborhood. I waited in silence till Lapierre had paid his second visit to the toll gate and ridden off homewards. Still I waited until old Stolliver and his boys returned into the house. Then I led the mare as softly as I could down the lane and around to the back of the barn, where we were safe from observation. I chuckled with insane glee at having eluded Lapierre, and then I was determined on a course of action. Like the egotistical villain I was, I had no more regard for your feelings than if you had been a stick or a stone. You should never suspect that I wilfully deserted you, and should be made to believe that I had been murdered. Having formed my plans, I led the mare along the edges of the fields, letting down the fences whenever it was necessary to do so, and putting them carefully up again after passing through. I made my way down past the rear end of John Calder's lot, and so on to the edge of the swamp behind Squire Harrington's. Bess would take no harm there during the night, and would be found safe on the morrow. I removed the bit from her mouth so that she could nibble the grass, and left the bridle hanging round her neck, securing it so that she would not be likely to trip or throw herself. I showed far more consideration for her than I did for the wife of my bosom. I removed the saddle so that she could lie down and roll if she felt that way disposed. I took the coat I had used for a pad and carried it a short distance into the swamp and threw it into a puddle of water. I deliberated whether I should puncture the end of my finger with my jackknife and stain my coat with the blood, but concluded that such a proceeding was unnecessary. I knew that you would be mystified by the coat, as you knew quite well that I had not worn it when I left in the morning. Then I bade farewell to poor Bess, and unaccountable as it may seem to you, I was profoundly touched at parting from her in such a way. I embraced her neck and kissed her on the forehead. As I tore myself away from her, I believe I was within an ace of shedding tears. Yet not a thought of compunction on your account penetrated my selfish soul. I picked my way through the swamp to the fourth concession, and then struck out across unfrequented fields of Harborough Station, 8 miles away. The moon was up, and the light shone brightly all the way, but I skulked along the borders of the out-of-the-way fields, and did not encounter a human being. As I drew near the station, I secreted myself on the dark side of an old shed, and lay in wait for the first train which might stop there. I did not have to remain more than about half an hour. A mixed train came along from the west, and as it drew up, I sprang on the platform of the last car but one. To the best of my knowledge, nobody saw me get aboard. I was not asked for my ticket until the train approached Hamilton, when I pretended I had lost it and paid my fare from Dundas, where I professed to have boarded the train. I got off at Hamilton. I waited for the eastbound express, which conveyed me to New York. End of chapter 14. Recording by Bob Sage. Chapter 15 of Savareen's Disappearance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bob Sage. The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent. Savareen's Disappearance, Chapter 15. Reginald Bourchier Savareen discovers the great secret. Thus far, Savareen had been permitted to tell his own story. I do not, of course, pretend that it came from his lips in the precise words set down in the foregoing chapter, but for the sake of brevity and clearness, I have deemed it best to present the most salient portion of the narrative in the first person. It was related to me years afterward by Mrs. Savareen herself, and I think I am warranted in saying that I have given the purport of her relation with tolerable accuracy. There is no need to present the sequel in the same fashion, nor with anything like the same fullness of detail. The man unburdened himself with all the appearance of absolute sincerity, and made no attempt to palliate or tone down anything that told against himself. He admitted that upon reaching New York he had entered upon a career of wild dissipation. He drank, gambled, and indulged in debauchery to such an extent that in less than 6 weeks he had got pretty nearly to the end of his £400. He assumed the false name and carefully abstained from ever looking at the newspapers, so that he remained in ignorance of all that had taken place in the neighborhood of his home after his departure. Becoming tired of the life he was leading in the great city, he proceeded southward and spent some months wandering about through the southern states. His knowledge of horseflesh enabled him to pick up a livelihood and even at times to make money, but his drinking propensities steadily gained the mastery over him and stood in the way of his permanent success in any pursuit. During a sojourn at a tavern in Lexington, Kentucky, he had formed an attachment for the daughter of his landlord. She was a good girl in her way, and knew how to take care of herself, but Mr. Jack Randall passed for a bachelor, and seemed to be several grades above the ordinary frequenters of her father's place. Their marriage and subsequent adventures have been sufficiently detailed by the unhappy woman herself during her conference with Mrs. Savareen at No. 77 Amity Street. The soi-disant Randall had gone on from bad to worse, until he had become the degraded creature of whom his wife had caught a momentary glimpse under the glare of gas lamp on her departure from the Amity Street lodgings. The woman who supposed herself to be his wife had informed him that a strange lady had called and been very kind to her, but she had told him nothing about the lady having come from Canada. Why she was thus reticent I am unable to say with certainty. Perhaps it was because she attached no importance to the circumstance, after the lady's declaration that the daguerreotype did not represent the man whom she wished to find. Perhaps she had some inkling of the truth, and dreaded to have her suspicions confirmed. She knew that she had but a short time to live, and may very well have desired to sleep her last sleep without making any discovery detrimental to her peace of mind. Whatever the cause may have been, she kept silent to everything but the main fact, that a kind lady had called and supplied her with a small store of money to provide for herself and the child. Savareen never learned, or even suspected, that the lady who ministered to the wants of his victims was his own wife, until the truth was told to him by the wife herself. Small difference to him, however, where the money came from. He had no scruples about taking a part of it to buy drink for himself, and one or two loafers he numbered among his personal acquaintances. But there was sufficient left to provide for all the earthly needs of the dying woman and her child. The little one breathed its last within 2 days of Mrs. Savareen's visit, and the mother followed it to the grave a week later. Since then Jack Randall had dragged on a solitary existence in New York, and had been on the very brink of starvation. Every half-dime he could lay hold of by hook or by brook, and I fear it was sometimes by both, was spent in the old way. Then his health suddenly broke down, and for the first time he knew what it was to be weak and ill. Finally he had been compelled to admit to himself that he was utterly beaten in the race of life, and with a profound depth of meanness which transcended any of his former acts, he had made up his mind to return in his want and despair to the wife whom he had so basely deserted. Since leaving Westchester he had heard nothing of her, direct or indirect, but he doubted not that she was supplied with the necessaries of life, and that she would yield him her forgiveness. It is possible to sympathize with the prodigal son, but whose heart is wide enough to find sympathy for such a prodigal husband as this? His wife heard him patiently out to the very end, and she told him of the arrival of Mr. Thomas Jefferson Haskins at the Royal Oak, and the consequent visit to New York. The recital did not greatly move him. The telling of his own story had again reduced him to a state of extreme exhaustion, and he was for the time being incapable of further emotion. He soon after dropped to sleep, and as he was tolerably certain not to awake until next morning, there was no occasion for further attendance upon him. Mrs. Savareen drew to another apartment to ponder a while before retiring to rest on the strange tale which she had heard. Next morning it was apparent that Savareen was alarmingly ill, and that his illness did not arise solely from exhaustion. A doctor was called in and soon pronounced his verdict. The patient was suffering from congestion of the lungs. The malady ran a rapid course, and in another week he lay white and cold in his coffin, the scar on his cheek showing like a great pale ridge on a patch of hoar frost. My story is told. The young widow donned the conventional weeds, the trappings and the suits of woe prescribed by custom under such circumstances. It is only reasonable to believe that she sincerely mourned the loss of her girlhood's ideal, but it was surely too much to expect that she should be overwhelmed by grief at the death of one who had been practically dead to her for years, and whose unworthiness had recently been so unmistakably brought home to her. With her subsequent fortunes the reader has no concern, but it can be no harm to inform him that she remains a widow still, and that she at this moment resides with her son, a prosperous lawyer, in one of the chief towns of Western Canada. End of chapter 16. Recording by Bob Sage. End of Savareen's disappearance. End of The Gerrard Street Mystery and Other Weird Tales by John Charles Dent.